It is a little ironic that this video was submitted in advance as a substitute for a live speech in order to mitigate the risk of technology, that our real-time remote conference app might have glitches. I'd like to speak about lessons learned as a mitigator against the extreme risks of exploring the unknowns of deep space. My name is David Oberhettinger, and I'm an astronautical engineer and the Chief Knowledge Officer of the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, in Pasadena, California. JPL is the world's leading spacecraft design and operations center for the robotic exploration of deep space. We have visited all of the planets and discovered 26 Earth-like exoplanets, placed 4 rovers on Mars, landed by a methane lake on Titan, and both Voyager spacecraft have left the solar system and are operating in interstellar space. We typically build a single unit of a spacecraft design. It may cost $1 billion, and it is designed to go somewhere humanity has never ventured. Deep space is extremely hostile to robots as well as humans, and so NASA is asking JPL to take risks that are not encountered by Earth satellites, risk traceable to the many unknowns. With so many unknowns in space exploration, we prefer to make new mistakes rather than repeat old mistakes. And so we have a mature lessons learned process. Our Lessons Learned Committee has met weekly since 1984. I believe that a formal lessons learned process is an effective countermeasure against avoidable risk. We all seek mission success and the success and survival of the organization, and errors made by NASA tend to be much more visible than those made by private companies. Possibly the closest analogy to a flight project in terms of risk and consequences is a military campaign. And the military probably invented formal lessons learning. They employ after-action reports and military historians to document their lessons, and the findings are a large part of the curriculum in military academies. Why? Because you can't prevent errors completely, but you can take steps to assure that they don't recur. Don't invade Russia in the winter. Otto von Bismarck stated, "Fools say that they learn by experience. I prefer to profit by others' experience." The military, or a quasi-military organization like an emergency services agency, has similar risks to life and limb, whereas JPL robotic missions risk primarily major national assets instead. So, if you're sold on the importance of a formal lessons learned process, then what are the prerequisites for an effective lessons learned process? 1, lessons important to the institution are identified and ranked. 2, lessons are credible. A range of technical viewpoints are reflected. 3, lessons are readable in terms of format, quality, writing, photos. 4, lessons are verified as accurate to avoid blowback. 5, important lessons are documented and approved. 6, lessons are disseminated internally and the projects assess compliance. 7, lessons are shared with sister agencies possibly. 8, lesson recommendations are infused to ensure a closed-loop process. 9, process also engages the institutional corrective action system. 10, your process is well documented. And 11, the process maturity undergoes continuous improvement. The first lesson learned practice I'd like to advocate is soliciting and vetting lesson candidates. Many organizations express difficulty with this step due perhaps to a reluctance to admit error. But given that NASA achievements like our recent successful landing of the Mars Science Laboratory rover on Mars are among the most complex and challenging in human history, ranking with the construction of the Panama Canal and U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, it is unlikely there are no lessons to be learned from such projects. Sources of lessons learned topics include anomaly reports, mishap reports, informal office conversations, etc. Be sure to include positive success factors as well as "don't do this again" items. So a second practice is to verify each candidate as a valid lessons learned. And there you need to establish a set of criteria for a valid lessons learned, such as relevance to mission success and likelihood of being of interest to future projects. So, okay, you have a dynamite list of candidates. How do you get each informant to write it up in a lessons learned format? Well, you ask him or her nicely and check back later, or you publish notices asking staff to submit lessons learned on their own initiative. You can do that. You can even provide incentives. It's never worked for me over 25 years of chairing the JPL Lessons Learned Committee. But if someone gives me a reference or two and I draft the lesson learned, I never have any difficulty getting them to review it. Yeah. So another best practice may be to consider assigning one person in your organization to draft all lessons learned. There's somewhat of a learning curve in following the standard JPL lesson format, and establishing some consistency means an easier job for our lessons learned committee in editing the draft and wordsmithing it. Then, once you have an actual lessons learned drafted, you need to verify the facts related to the driving event. It would be personally embarrassing to publish a lesson only to have the person who is at the scene of the crime, so to speak, later tell you that's not what happened. So verify and keep a copy of your notes in case you're challenged on the facts later. Practical advice. Right? Next, I believe that lessons learned should be well written. Assume that your reader has only 1 minute to get to the gist of the lesson. If it's not clearly written, they may never return to the lesson repository. Most of the JPL lessons learned include photos, and they all list a set of references that provide further information and lend credibility. When we have a good draft lesson and submit it to the Lessons Learned Committee, it's an opportunity for the committee to revalidate the topic as a valid lessons learned, given that you now have more detailed information. Then it may take 2 or 3 one-hour meetings, going over the draft line by line, for us to advance the draft and get agreement on it. The practice of having a lessons learned committee means that you have representatives from different disciplines representing different viewpoints, making your lesson learned more bulletproof. Other than the lessons learned committee, I think JPL's most important lessons learned practice is what I call lessons learned infusion. You just cannot rely on the proper person reading and acting on the key lesson at the appropriate point in the project life cycle to ensure that the lesson gets acted upon, that the project considers implementing the lesson learned recommendation. So, JPL decided to infuse our lessons learned into our procedures and training. For example, each paragraph in our 2 engineering Bibles, the JPL Design Principles and the JPL Flight Project Practices documents, has hot links to relevant lessons learned written by JPL and other NASA field centers. This infusion practice has 2 practical benefits. One, you don't have to depend on a subject matter expert reading your lessons because they have been infused into your business practices. And 2, you have objective evidence that you have achieved a closed loop on your lessons learned process. Finally, a word about metrics. What can be measured can be managed. Your leadership may demand that you measure continuous process improvement, I find obtaining useful metrics to be rather difficult. As Albert Einstein said, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. For example, NASA consistently reports more than 2,000 page views per month of NASA lessons learned. That seems an indicator that NASA lessons learned are in demand. On the other hand, a single page view may save a spaceflight mission, but you would not necessarily learn of that datum. I dallied a bit with process maturity models, but they tend to place the highest value on processes that are repeatable. That may be appropriate for an emergency services agency, but less appropriate for space exploration, where we rarely repeat a mission. And you may possibly place a higher value on agility than repeatability. At the least, you should have some anecdotal success stories up your sleeve for when management asks for lessons learned program justification. JPL's maxim is, dare mighty things. NASA demands that we undertake only spaceflight missions that involve exceptionally high risk and allow contractors to undertake lesser missions. That is, stuff that's been done before. But to dare mighty things means to make mistakes. So we must learn from them. In the words of the Duke of Wellington describing the failed Dutch campaign of 1794, quote, "Why, I learnt what one ought not to do, and that is always something," unquote. Thank you.